Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. And here we are. And this is a major section dealing with the halachot of Pesach. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. And Moses and Aaron are being informed by God on what the mitzvah is that the Israelites are supposed to do. Okay. So we're in the middle of this verse, and I'm going to go back to the beginning of this verse back here. So, V'haya lachem lemishmeret, right? They're supposed to take this lamb on the 10th day of the month, and we are informed that that is not what is normally done at any future Pesach. As much as it's to be an annual ritual, this is not part of the annual ritual. It's only the Pesach of Egypt, Pesach de Mitzrayim. So they're supposed to take the lamb, designate this lamb on the 10th day, and they're supposed to look at it, inspect it. That's, as Rashi explains, the lishmeret, that they're to inspect it and make sure it has no blemishes. Ad arba'a asar yom, until the 14th day, l'chodesh hazeh, for this month, according to this month, v'shachatu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael ben ha'arbayim, and the entire assembly shall slaughter it in the evening. So here we go. They shall slaughter it, etc. Here's the Rashi. V'chi kulan shochtin. So here we go. Since when do every single one of them slaughter the lamb? Okay, only a few have it slaughtered or slaughter it. So why does it say they? Why all of them? Ela mikan. And from this we learn a very, very important principle in Jewish law. Sheshlucho shel adam kamoto, that a person's agent is the same as themselves. That legally speaking, if you ask someone else to do a mission for you, give someone else a mission, and they accomplish the mission, it's as if you did it yourself. So, for example, if I give you $100 to deposit into my bank account, and you go ahead and deposit that $100, it has the same legal implication as if I had done it myself. It doesn't matter the fact that I asked you to do this. Now, are there sometimes exceptions to this rule? Well, of course, we know circumstances may alter cases. But in general, this is an important principle. And so one practical application is, you know, that we have in traditional davening, we have a prayer leader, and after certain prayers, certainly a bracha, something like that, very many times. After the prayer leader says the bracha, they say amen. And the whole idea, I want to go back again, I may have mentioned this, the idea of mitzvot being an obligation, and that when you fulfill the mitzvah, it's as if you have paid off a debt, as if you have paid off that obligation. And so, again, we're talking about legally speaking, this sort of legal background to this, that if that prayer leader makes a bracha that you are obligated to say as well, and you say amen to their bracha, it's as if you said it yourself. And you are therefore have quit your obligation, you're quit of your obligation. And by the way, on a practical level, unless it's something that's actually written into the prayer itself, when you make a bracha yourself, you generally don't say amen to your own bracha. That is the Department of Redundancy department, and you don't want to repeat yourself when you make brachot. That is considered a bracha levatala, a wasted bracha. So there's some interesting, I would say, meditation, careful examination of the very nature of making brachot and the various types of brachot, but the idea that we have a sense of being indebted to God for the life we have and for so many of the incredible blessings that life presents to us, and to have that sense of wanting to fulfill an obligation to God. And this idea of shluchosh. Yes, please.
Thank you. So during the Chatzi Kaddish, when it comes to V'imru,
Mhm.
Amen, do you say that because we're saying, and let us say Amen, or do
That's
we
correct. That's
just
the
back
context.
off?
Yeah, correct. So you do say V'imru Amen because it's telling the congregation, it's informing the congregation to say Amen, right?
Okay,
So
gotcha. I got you. I
yeah,
got the difference. Thank you.
you're not saying Amen to your own bracha. You're informing the congregation that this is where they need to say Amen. Yeah,
Gotcha. Thank
right.
you.
You bet. And that's why, by the way, especially through Zoom, we repeated the Amen. What's happened in general is that people join in that Amen at that moment. You could argue that there's some support for that, although I like what we do on Zoom as well, that you're so eager to say Amen, and you know you're going to have to do it, and that's why you join the reader in saying Amen when they say Amen. You're doing it together. But on the other hand, saying Amen after they've told you to say Amen, there's some merit to that as well. You can go in both directions there. So, Kahal Adat Yisrael. So there's some repetition here, right? So we're talking about the assembly of the community of Israel. So let's take a look at the sentence. The sentence could have said, and this is typical of an analysis, right, of traditional analysis and midrashic analysis. It could have said, "V'shachatu oto Yisrael bein ha'arbayim," or "V'shachatu oto kol Yisrael bein ha'arbayim," and it would have meant the same thing. What is the purpose of saying Kahal Adat Yisrael? In other words, if we have words that appear to be on the surface unnecessary, the argument is, and this is a very well-worn sort of idea, right, is that the Torah had some special purpose in being apparently redundant. And so the job becomes ours then to figure out what is the purpose of this apparent redundancy, because the assumption is that since these words are holy words, that they came from the divine source itself, that there are no wasted words in the Torah. So we're going to see. So here we go. Kahal Adat Yisrael. Kahal v'Adah v'Yisrael. Right? All three. Mikan Amru. And from this, they derived a practice. Pische Tzibur, that the Pesach offerings, the lambs of the community, of the entire group, right? Nishchatin b'shalosh kitot. That there are three groups that when they came, Erev Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, to the temple, to slaughter their paschal lambs, because that is the only place that one is permitted to perform the ritual of the paschal lamb itself. There would be three large groups. Zo achar zo, one following the other. Nichneset kat rishona, the first group would enter the temple courtyard where their lambs would be slaughtered. Nin alu daltot azara, at which point the gates or the doors of the courtyard, of the temple courtyard, would be locked, etc. Kedeita b'psachim, as is mentioned in the tractate Psachim on page 64. So this is derived from this fact of this apparent redundancy here. Kahal Adat Yisrael. So three groups. Bein Harbayim. So this is generally we describe this as in the evening, but that is a little bit, I would say, misinformation. It leads you to possibly a mistake, right? Because what Rashi is going to tell you what Bein Harbayim means. okay? Mishe sha'ot v'lamala. He's saying it's from the 6th hour and upwards. So the day starts at 6 a.m., according to rabbinic time. And so the 6th hour would be noon, right? And noon, of course, is, again, astronomically, it's when the sun is positioned at its zenith over you. Okay, so in other words, from that point on, the sun starts to decline into the west, and that's Karui Bein Ha'arbayim. So the entire afternoon, right, is called Bein Ha'arbayim. And he goes further with this. Shahashemesh nota, sorry, let me try and read this. I'm sorry. Note, it's hard for me to read this. The bait, sorry, it's a bait. The sun starts to lean levet mavoor, to its place of coming, meaning, the horizon, right? The western horizon. La'arov, to mix or to start to get dark. The lashon bein ha'arbayim, and Rashi's, sorry about that. I didn't recognize immediately because of this shmudge here in the top, right? Ulashon bein ha'arbayim, and this term bein ha'arbayim, ni'eh be'enai. Rashi now, as he rarely does, gives a personal opinion. He says, it seems in my eyes, in other words, in my humble opinion, otan sha'ot, those hours, shebein aravit hayom, between the evening or the declination of the day, in other words, the darkening of the day, the arvit halayla, and the darkness of the night. Arivat hayom betchilat sheva sha'ot, and he's saying that the day starts to darken at the beginning of the 7th hour. So up to noon, the beginning of the 7th hour would be afternoon, okay? Miki yintu slale erev, okay? And I think this is a quote he's given possibly, or maybe not. He says, for the shadows of the evening start to stretch out. They start to get longer. V'arevat halayla betchilat halayla, and the blend, the word arev also has to do with mixture or blend, meaning the darkening of the night starts at nightfall itself, or in the evening. So bein ha'arbayim, arbayim, of course, is a dual plural, like mishkafayim means eyeglasses and oznayim means ears. In other words, words that are dual plurals. And so he's saying this is because it's from the darkening of the day to the darkening of the night, the beginning of the darkening of night. And that's why this is the time when the Pesach is brought, as the day starts to dim. Erev Lashon Neshef. He says this word Erev has the meaning of Neshef, which is dim or dark, B'choshech, and darkness. And he gives the quote. Forgive me, before that was not a quote. And he says, Isaiah chapter 24, Arva shel kol simcha. All her joy, or all the joy has become dark. Next verse. Belakhu min hadam. So remember, they're slaughtering this lamb, and when you slaughter a lamb, there's blood. You take the blood from the neck where the cut is made, okay? Belakhu min hadam. They shall take some of the blood, Benatnu al shtei mezuzot, and they shall place it on the 2 doorposts, the al hamashkof, and on the lintel, the top bar of the door. Now, so obviously there was no temple in Egypt, right? So they had to do this themselves back home. But again, not every single Israelite in a family was going to actually slaughter it. They would probably have someone designated in each group that would actually slaughter the lamb. and then they're going to take the blood and place it on the two doorposts and on the lintel, al habatim, on the homes, on the houses, asher yuchlu oto bahem, in which they are going to consume this Pesach. So this special offering. So it wasn't just any door, it had to be the door of the house in which they would eat the Pesach. So notice all these details regarding the laws of Pesach and what needs to be done. And just to go back and say, this is how one demonstrates one's love of God, is by being willing to do what God tells us to do, commands us to do. V'lakhu min hadam, and they should take from the blood. Zo kabbalat hadam. This is referring to the receiving of the blood. In other words, they pay. So basically, let's keep going. Yachol b'yad. Okay, does that mean in their hand, like they just make their palm and make a cup out of their palm and take the blood in their hands? Talmud Lomar, for this reason, in another verse, in verse 22, the Torah refers to Asher Basaf, which is in the basin. So what they would do is they take a basin, place it under the neck when they made the cut, and the blood would flow into the basin. So, but that's in a different place. But we know now that they had to use a vessel for the blood. HaMezuzot, the doorposts. And again, not a common word if one isn't already familiar with it. Haim hazakufot. This is referring to the upright posts of the door. Achat mikan bifat lepetach v'achat mikan. Sorry, one on one side of the opening and one on the other side. Hamashkof, the mashkof, remember we translated it as lintel, hu al alyon, and that is the upper post, the post over the top, shahadelet shokef alav, on which the door strikes. So that's apparently how they made their doors, and the door would stop there because that's what would prevent the door from going further in its direction. Kesh says, so green oto, when they close the door. And here is the word in French, lintel, alas. And in Yiddish, it's oberschwelle, over something, right? Velashon shkifa, okay, and the term shkifa, kabata, it refers to striking, mashkof, the striker, right? The one which is stricken, right? Kamo, and he gives an example here in Leviticus 26. It says, Kol ale nidaf, which means, let's see how he spelled that. The voice, kol, with a kuf, the voice of a leaf striking, a leaf beating a leaf, in other words. And this is the Aramaic translation. Tarfa teshakif, a leaf, tarfa teshakif, which is beating, this noise. Chabura, and he translates, apparently, again, the Aramaic translation of chabura, a sore injury or a sore, mashkifi, in other words, where you've been beaten, right? Mashkifi. Al habatim, okay, asher yuchlu oto bahem. So literally it means on, right, on the houses in which you will eat in them. Velo al mashkof umezuzot shebabayit. Okay. So it says, and not on the lintel and the doorposts, shebabeit hateven. In other words, we're not referring to doing it on the doorposts and the lintel of a storehouse. Tevin, I believe, is straw, right? That, in other words, stuff that you're storing, tevin, uvet habakar, and also in a stable. This is where actually they would put a cow shed, for example, she'ein darim b'tocho, in which one does not actually live. You don't live in those houses. So while it says al havatim, he's saying to you why it says asher yuchlu oto bahem, that the reason why it adds that particular piece is to tell you you don't put the blood on the doorposts of homes in which you don't live. Incidentally, I believe it's a similar halacha that applies to putting up a mezuzah. So I believe I've read elsewhere that, for example, do you put a mezuzah up on an office building? Do you put a doorpost, a mezuzah on the doorpost of a synagogue? Because do we actually live in a synagogue? So there's some argument, I guess, back and forth as to whether or not one is obligated to put a mezuzah up on such public buildings.
Well, I assume first of all that that the mezuzah laws came from this, right?
Indeed, they did.
And then as far as office, for instance, some people spend more time in their office than at home, and they are certainly spending that time living as opposed to a storage for animals or wheat, which are not, straw, which are not people at all. So maybe it's if the building is made for people
Mhm.
and they will be living and spending time in there, they will be maybe having meals in there. They'll be going to the bathroom in there. They'll be working, but they're living and it's and especially if it's made for Jewish people as opposed to like a church.
Right.
Then I would think then there would be mezuzahs,
Mhm.
but also what I don't understand is like why, if you have a mezuzah on the entrances of your homes, would you need mezuzahs on the entrances to your bedrooms, for example?
Agreed. That may be considered, I mean, that's a whole different issue, right? And in a way that may be considered hidur mitzvah. In other words, maybe people consider that while it's not an essential part of a mitzvah, that it is a way of beautifying the mitzvah. I see that David had his hand up. Yeah, thanks. I'll comment that later. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So did they actually spread the blood on just one doorpost or both doorposts?
I believe it's both. I believe the implication of the verse is both. Yes.
Right. That's what I thought, because that it's doorpost when we say the prayer. So the question is, why don't we put mezuzot on both sides? Right. I mean, yeah. Why aren't they? They're just on one post of the door. Why aren't they on both sides?
Right.
Maybe they are sometimes. I don't know.
So it's a great question, and I think I have the answer. That when you look at the mitzvah of putting it on the doorpost, now when we're talking about in the Shema, when it's mezuzot, the vav is missing. So in other words, it's not a plural word as it's spelled, even though we pronounce it as a plural. It's the kativ is actually a singular, as mezuzat. So that would be on one doorpost. And by the way, we don't put it up on the lintel either. So, the mitzvah is not the same. It's a reminder. It's a clear reminder. And by the way, the idea is that it is a protection, that God is protecting us. I'll comment on that in a moment. Let me go back to Lauren's comment. And how do you define living? Well, look at the sukkah. It says you shall dwell in the sukkah for 7 days, okay? And part of the reason you don't, there's a classic question of, do you put a mezuzah up on a sukkah? And the answer is no. And the reason is because it's not a permanent dwelling. So in the same way in which your home is a permanent dwelling, because you're only going to be in there for 7 days or 8 days, and then you're going to leave. So again, though, what do we mean by living in the sukkah? Because it says, you shall dwell in the sukkah for 7 days in the Torah. And dwelling is understood as eating and sleeping. And so if we're strict about eating and sleeping as being the definitions of living in a place, well, you might eat in an office. Hopefully, you're not sleeping in the office. Okay, certainly you're not going to bed. Unless it's a certain kind of work, I suppose. But basically, there are reasons for not putting a mezuzah up on your workplace. And again, it's not like you go and formally rest and sleep in a synagogue either, even though you might eat there communally. So those are you look at one halacha where you have such a concept, and we can see if there's a way to apply it to a totally different halacha. In this case, taking from the laws of Sukkot and seeing how we might apply them to the laws of the mezuzah in this particular case.
Because you do eat and sleep in the sukkah.
Correct, you do, but it's not permanent. In other words, you need all those things. It needs to be your permanent residence. And you have to eat and you have to sleep there. You need all those things. They're necessary, but not sufficient. Eating and sleeping are necessary, but not sufficient.
You probably will doze in your office chair every once in a while, but you won't necessarily go to bed.
Right, no, it's not going to bed. It's not. It's considered, and there's a distinction made. And by the way, this has to do with Purim, that if you doze a little bit while you're listening to the Megillah, because it's a long piece. And again, the halacha, the oral law is very practical. It has to be. And so the question is, what happens if you're kind of dozing while the Megillah is being read? And the question then becomes, to what degree? Are you sound asleep? Are you kind of just losing it a little bit? And the halacha is interested in making those distinctions as to whether or not you fulfilled your obligation. So you might doze in your office, but it's not like you're going to bed. So that's the thing there. Okay, just excuse me 1 second. All right. Okay. Very good. Let's see a little bit more. No, I think we're going to have to stop here. Let me see. Let me see. No, okay, we did finish this, so we will start next year. I'm afraid this stuff it's hard to leave it, and but we'll have certainly more halachot eventually. So here we go. Let me take this here, and for next year. Very good. And I'll stop the share. And let's see, how are we doing here? We don't have a minion, but okay.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
I don't understand why God can't distinguish between the Israelis and the Egyptians when He's God, unless the plague doesn't recognize anybody, and therefore God said, the only way the angel of death can recognize the Israelis is on the blood on the post and on the outside. That's the only thing I can see, because the plague doesn't recognize anybody. But God, I mean, I don't understand. God didn't have to do all this if God knew where the Israelis are.
Okay.
But I imagine the plague doesn't. I don't know. I can't understand it.
So let me try and answer your question quickly. The answer is that on some levels, there is a principle that when there's wholesale destruction, it's very difficult to distinguish between righteous and not righteous. But I believe the real reason is already given, that when we had that Rashi yesterday, where God says, it's time for the oath that I made to Abraham to come about now. And I'm not going to give the Israelites some mitzvot to perform. So the answer is that, again, getting freebies doesn't give you any sense of honor, and earning your benefit gives you honor. And so God wanted to give the Israelites an opportunity to perform these mitzvot of Pesach, of this Pesach in Egypt, so that they would deserve the redemption that they were going to receive. And that's a very, very important principle within Judaism. And I mentioned this before, that while we do believe in grace, which means, free, that God is, when we take grace, it means undeserved kindness. Nevertheless, wherever possible, it's so important to earn what you're making. And there's this very great sense that when things are just doled out to you, it does something to your sense of worthiness and respect and stuff like that. So even though what you're saying is true, God might well have been able to distinguish it. And look, we can go all the way back and say, why did God put the Israelites through the slavery to begin with? You know, we could ask that question. And in a way, I think the Seder comes to answer that particular question. So, and to learn, and it has, the brief answer to that is to learn the importance of adversity. That adversity is actually a tremendous, tremendous benefit on some levels. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.